Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that looks beautiful, but quietly kills you in your sleep. A time when the most fashionable homes in the world doubled as gas chambers disguised in floral print. We're stepping inside the Victorian era, where elegance and arsenic shared the same walls, and where every breath you took brought you one cough closer to the grave. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these dives into history. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1875 in a respectable Victorian townhouse. The good news, you're finally part of the middle class. The bad news, your walls are covered in shimmering green wallpaper that is slowly murdering you in your sleep. You blink awake beneath a heavy quilt that smells faintly of mothballs, coal smoke, and the kind of soap that never actually gets anything clean. The air feels thick, almost damp, as though the room itself is sweating. You cough, and it echoes through the silence like an accusation. The wallpaper glows faintly in the dim morning light, a rich, dazzling green so vibrant it looks alive. Which it is, in the worst possible way, because that perfect emerald hue comes courtesy of arsenic. Yes, arsenic. The same stuff once used for rats, rivals, and the occasional inconvenient spouse. In the 19th century, chemists figured out how to bind it into pigments like Scheele's green and Paris green. The result was breathtakingly beautiful. It was also breathtaking in the literal sense, since breathing it in eventually destroyed your lungs. And of course, everyone wanted it. Green wallpaper became the Instagram filter of its day. Nurseries were decorated in it. Dining rooms shimmered with leafy patterns. Even the bedrooms where you lay your head at night were plastered floor to ceiling with poison. Doctors started noticing strange things. Families wasted away with mysterious stomach cramps. Children developed rashes and nosebleeds. Women fainted in parlors while men stumbled home with splitting headaches. But because the science of germs wasn't fully there yet, most people blamed it on bad air, or miasma. Few thought to point the finger at the floral wallpaper curling in the corner. And yet, here you are, lying in your fashionable green bedroom, lungs filling slowly with microscopic arsenic dust that flaked from the walls every time someone opened a window. Not that Victorians opened windows very often. Fresh air was considered suspicious. Better to keep everything tightly shut and let the wallpaper get to work. So you lie there, feeling your throat tighten, your head throb, and your skin itch. The more elegant your wallpaper, the more miserable your mornings. And still, Victorians loved it. Because nothing said sophistication quite like slowly dying in a room that looked like an enchanted forest. But if you think poisonous wallpaper was bad, just wait until you see what else the Victorians coated in arsenic. Because the danger didn't stop at the walls. It crept into what you wore, what you touched, and even what you put directly on your skin. You step out of your poisoned Victorian bedroom thinking fresh air will help, but it only delivers you into another trap. Because the wallpaper was just the beginning. The very clothes you put on in the morning, and the powders you pat on your face could also be laced with arsenic. To live in style during the 19th century meant treating your body like a science experiment, where the control group always lost. Bright green fabrics were the height of sophistication. Ball gowns, children's frocks, even artificial flower decorations glowed with the same pigment as the wallpaper. Scheele's green had crept off the walls and onto your body. Fashion magazines of the day praised dresses with shimmering green skirts that looked alive in candlelight. They did not mention that those dresses could literally rub raw sores into your skin after a night of dancing. Women reported blisters and rashes where the dye touched their arms. Some even lost patches of hair when the fabric brushed against their necks. And it was not limited to clothing. Cosmetics were equally dangerous. Face powders and rouges often contained arsenic, lead and mercury. A pale complexion was prized because it suggested wealth, delicacy, and the kind of lifestyle where you did not have to sweat in the fields. But achieving that look required coating your pores in toxic dusts that worked slowly from the outside in. Imagine waking up already coughing from your wallpaper, then carefully brushing arsenic across your cheeks in the mirror before heading out. It was less a beauty routine and more a slow-motion execution dressed as vanity. What makes it more absurd is that people noticed the side effects but often explained them away. Women fainting at parties was considered normal. Splotchy skin and headaches were chalked up to weak constitutions. If your lips turned blue after a night in your emerald gown, perhaps you were just cold. The fact that the fashion industry was basically selling wearable rat poison did not dent demand. Green remained the trend. Wealthy households paid more to suffer faster. Doctors did try to sound alarms. In 1861, an article in the British Medical Journal described a case where a young girl fell ill after wearing a green dress. Her symptoms matched arsenic poisoning. Chemists confirmed the pigment dusted from the fabric as it moved. The article warned against the use of arsenical dyes in clothing, but like most public health warnings in the Victorian era, it struggled to compete with the power of fashion. Looking wealthy was always more important than living long enough to enjoy it. Even artificial flowers sold for decorating hats and parlors were steeped in arsenic. Young women employed to make them often worked with their hands constantly dusted in green powder. Their nails discoloured, their skin burned, and some collapsed from inhaling particles all day long. Imagine going to work every morning in a cheerful shop, only to realise your job was slowly dissolving your lungs. They called it arsenical poisoning, but it might as well have been labelled occupational fashion fatality. And if you think this was limited to elite households, it wasn't. Cheap ornaments and toys for children often contained arsenic dyes as well. It was affordable and vibrant, and no one wanted to give up the illusion of beauty. A child could hug a toy horse stuffed with poison, sleep against an arsenic pillow, and tumble about in a nursery painted in green patterns. Victorian parenting was already questionable, but this was practically weaponized negligence. You picture yourself now walking into a Victorian ball. The air is heavy with perfume, coal smoke, and sweat. Women swirl in glittering gowns, glowing emerald under chandeliers. Men press against their arms, oblivious to the fact that their very touch could absorb poison. The floor sparkles with green dust shaken loose from countless dresses. Everyone is smiling, clapping, bowing, congratulating themselves on their wealth and refinement. No one mentions the coughing, the headaches, the fainting. It is easier to call it faint romance than chemical warfare. The deeper you go into this world, the more you realise arsenic had become a silent partner in Victorian daily life. It touched your skin, it sat on your dinner table, it drifted into your lungs. The very symbol of refinement was also a hidden death sentence. And while science was catching on, commerce moved faster. Why worry about the long-term effects when you could sell another gown, another wallpaper roll, another bouquet of fake flowers to the next family desperate to look respectable? As you wipe a bead of sweat from your forehead, you feel the grit of the arsenic powder against your skin. The lights shimmer, your throat tightens, and you wonder if the faintness in your head is elegance or just the slow burn of toxins. In the Victorian world, there was hardly a difference. Beauty was a gamble, and most people lost. But the story does not stop with dresses and rouge. The Victorians found even more ways to lace their daily lives with quiet danger. Because if arsenic could decorate your walls and paint your cheeks, it could just as easily find its way into what you ate and drank. And it did. You step away from the glowing gowns and perfumed arsenic powders thinking maybe a meal will steady you. But Victorian kitchens were not places of refuge. If the wallpaper didn't choke you, and the fashion didn't blister your skin, there was always the food waiting to finish the job. The era's obsession with cheap production and dazzling presentation meant your dinner table was just another laboratory of poison, and most families sat down every evening with their plates full of slow-acting experiments. Bread was the cornerstone of the Victorian diet, but it was rarely just flour and yeast. Millers often whitened flour with alum, a chemical that made loaves look refined and expensive, even when they were poor quality. It gave the bread a chalky brightness that suggested purity, but also scraped the lining of your stomach on the way down. If you were lucky, the loaf only weakened you over time. If you were unlucky, It was also stretched with plaster dust, sawdust, or powdered bones. Nothing said family dinner quite like chewing something that had been stolen from a construction site. Then there was the milk. In London alone, thousands of gallons were sold daily to a public desperate for nourishment, but cows were often kept in filthy urban yards and fed leftover brewery grains. The milk they produced was thin and bluish, so sellers thickened it with chalk, sweetened it with sugar, and sometimes added a touch of starch to keep it from separating. Children gulped it down with their porridge, while parents congratulated themselves for keeping them healthy, not realizing the breakfast bowl was more chemical mixture than nutrition. Even beer and wine carried hidden surprises. To give drinks an appealing clarity or foam, brewers sometimes added copper salts. Arsenic found its way into beer through contaminated sugar used in the brewing process. In 1900, a mass poisoning in Manchester killed more than 70 people and sickened over 6,000 after arsenic-tainted beer swept through the city. The investigation revealed that toxic brewing materials had been circulating for years, so a simple pint at the pub could quietly put you on the list of the departed, and the landlord pouring it probably had no idea. Candy was no safer. Victorian sweet shops were famous for their colourful displays, but those vibrant hues came from chemical dyes that belonged in an apothecary, not a child's mouth. Bright green sweets often contained arsenic, while reds might be coloured with lead oxide. A child could hand over a penny for a bag of boiled sugar drops, and leave with something that doubled as rat poison. Parents thought they were treating their children. In reality, they were offering up a small dose of morbidity wrapped in paper. And then came the preservatives. Before refrigeration, keeping meat fresh was a constant challenge. Butchers rubbed cuts with boracic acid to prevent decay, giving them a suspiciously glossy finish. Fishmongers used the same trick on fillets that should have been thrown out days earlier. If you bought sausages on the street, you were gambling with your life. Some were stretched with flour paste, others bulked out with ground-up scraps, and many were sold when they were already halfway spoiled. Eating one was like spinning a wheel where the prize could be dinner or diarrhea. Your Victorian kitchen, of course, also had the tableware to consider. Glazed ceramics were often coloured with lead-based paints. Drinking vessels leached poison with every pour of cider. The fanciest homes proudly displayed crystal goblets that sparkled under candlelight, but the lead that made them glimmer also seeped into the sherry. Every toast was a small toxic baptism, and the clinking of glasses was more a countdown than a celebration. And what made all of this even worse was the sheer lack of regulation. The first laws against food adulteration in Britain only arrived in the mid-19th century, and enforcement was spotty at best. Inspectors struggled to keep up with thousands of vendors, many of whom argued that a little chemical improvement was harmless. After all, customers wanted their bread white, their beer clear, and their candy colourful. If a few became ill, it was written off as coincidence. You picture yourself at a Victorian dining table now. A roast gleams under lamplight, the bread basket steams, and a decanter of ruby-coloured wine sparkles beside the cutlery. It looks inviting, civilised, almost modern. You lift your fork, take a bite, and within minutes feel the faint scratch in your throat, the metallic edge on your tongue, the heaviness in your stomach. This was the price of dinner. It was not a feast, it was an endurance test, and every meal was another wager on how much your body could withstand. The wealthiest families suffered too, though often in subtler ways. Fine cakes were coloured with vivid chemical dyes. Imported wines carried traces of arsenic from production. Even chocolate, which was just beginning to sweep through Europe as a luxury, sometimes contained fillers that had no business inside a confection. The richer your spread, the more varied your potential sources of contamination. Ironically, being poor often meant simpler meals with fewer additives, though even the humblest loaf of bread could still betray you. As you sit in that Victorian dining room, you realise the same logic ran through every corner of life. Progress and modernity were worshipped, appearances mattered above all, and safety was rarely a concern until disaster made it unavoidable. Food was only another reflection of this pattern. Families gathered, plates filled, Candles flickered, and poison moved quietly from hand to hand. The cough you began with in your green bedroom has returned, this time chased by a stomach cramp that makes you shift uncomfortably in your chair. You take a sip of wine to steady yourself, only to feel the faint chemical tang that tells you something unnatural has followed it down. You wonder how many more evenings your body can play host to these invisible visitors before it gives in. For many Victorians, the answer was not long, and yet this world only grew more inventive. If food could betray you and wallpaper could smother you, there were still the cleaning products, medicines, and everyday household goods to contend with. These promised relief, but often carried new dangers, and the cupboards of Victorian homes became arsenals of unintended consequences. Your Victorian dinner has left you queasy, but relief seems close at hand. After all, the era prided itself on progress. Shelves were filled with powders, bottles and tins promising to scrub your home clean and cure every ache from toothaches to melancholy. Yet each solution carried its own hazard, and reaching for relief often meant trading one poison for another. The cleaning cupboard was a minefield. Arsenic, so beloved in wallpaper and fashion, also appeared in insecticides sold to keep vermin at bay. Housewives dusted arsenic powder in pantries to ward off cockroaches, not realizing that stray particles drifted into bread bins. Rat poison was left casually in kitchens where it looked indistinguishable from flour or sugar. The line between seasoning and slaughter could be a single misplaced scoop. Soap, the supposed symbol of cleanliness, was frequently cut with harsh chemicals. Some varieties contained caustic soda strong enough to strip skin. Brightly coloured laundry powders glowed with dyes that irritated lungs when inhaled. Victorian homes smelled strongly of freshness, but freshness was a cloud of toxins swirling in the air. And because ventilation was thought dangerous, windows stayed tightly shut, turning every scrubbing session into an impromptu gas chamber. Medicines were no safer. In fact, they were worse. Victorians adored patent remedies, miracle cures sold in bottles with grandiose labels. Laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, was handed out as casually as cough syrup. Mothers dosed crying infants with it, grateful for the silence, not realizing they were feeding their children a narcotic that could halt breathing. Adults swallowed it for everything from headaches to heartbreak, turning the population into a nation of drowsy addicts. Mercury also enjoyed a starring role in medicine. It appeared in ointments meant to treat syphilis, rubbed directly into the skin until gums blackened and teeth loosened. Pills laced with calomel, a mercury chloride, were recommended for constipation and liver complaints. The more they sickened you, the more convinced people became that the treatment was working. Pain was interpreted as proof of potency, not toxicity. Even tonics advertised for health were traps. Arsenic tonics were marketed as energizers that improved skin and sharpened the mind. Pamphlets claimed that small doses harden the body against disease, an idea borrowed from the dangerous practice of taking microdoses to build tolerance. In reality, the slow accumulation of arsenic weakened the body until fatigue, digestive failure and skin lesions became unavoidable. People thought they were buying strength. What they purchased was a faster path to collapse. Cosmetics and medicine often blurred together. Hair tonics promised thickness and shine but carried lead salts that absorbed through the scalp. Tooth powders contained pumice and brick dust that wore enamel away, sprinkled with chemicals that poisoned gums. Skin creams mixed with mercury whitened complexions while destroying nervous systems. To be clean and presentable was to invite illness under another name. The most sinister part was the packaging. Bottles were beautifully labelled with flowing script and decorative borders. Remedies promised safe relief and gentle comfort in language that concealed their contents. The advertising industry grew alongside the poison trade, transforming toxins into commodities with elegant branding. Families lined their shelves with little glass soldiers of sickness, reassured by the promise of modern science. Children were particularly vulnerable. Teething mixtures contained morphine, sometimes in doses strong enough to kill outright. Sleep syrups for restless infants were essentially liquid opiates. Mothers desperate for rest relied on them, not realising each spoonful edged closer to tragedy. And because infant mortality was already high, deaths were often blamed on weak constitutions rather than the bottles sitting in plain sight. You stand in the Victorian kitchen and glance at the shelf where dozens of bottles gleam in lamplight. Cough syrups, pain relievers, stomach tonics, and cleaning powders promise safety and relief. The labels glimmer with words like pure, refreshing, invigorating. You reach for one, uncork the stopper, and inhale a sharp chemical bite that stings your nose. It feels wrong, but in this world, it is the ordinary scent of progress. The irony is that many of these substances did work in the short term. Laudanum silenced pain and calmed nerves. Mercury did kill certain infections. Arsenic did clear blemishes, if only temporarily. The problem was the price. The relief was brief, the damage lasting. Victorians lived in a constant cycle of cure and relapse, mistaking their medicines for salvation, while they quietly dissolved from the inside out. The worst tragedies were public. Newspapers reported cases of families poisoned when mislabeled bottles were sold by careless apothecaries. Stories circulated of children given the wrong dose and never waking again. Yet even then, outrage rarely lasted. There was always another miracle cure arriving in the next shipment, another tonic promising that modernity could solve ancient suffering. As you wipe your hands after testing a powder on the shelf, you notice the faint burning in your fingertips. A dull ache begins to rise behind your eyes. The medicine that promised relief has delivered only another weight pressing down, and you realise that there was no escape in this house, no refuge in any room. Every cure was a curse wearing polite clothes, but the home was not the only space where poison lurked. Step outside into the Victorian city and the very streets, factories and shops offered new hazards waiting in plain sight. The danger did not end at the front door. It spread across cobblestones and chimneys, and the wider world was as lethal as the bedroom you left behind. You open the door and step out into the Victorian city, thinking perhaps the outside world will give you some relief. Instead, you're greeted by a haze so thick it feels like you're trying to breathe through a chimney. The air clings to your throat, gritty and sour, coating your tongue in soot. Your eyes sting as though you have walked directly into a bonfire, and in a way you have. Because Victorian cities were always burning, always belching smoke, always smothering themselves in their own fumes. Coal was the lifeblood of the age. It powered factories, trains, ships, and household fireplaces. But every ton burned left its ghost in the sky. By the mid-19th century, London consumed millions of tons of coal every year. The result was a permanent cloud of smoke and sulphur hanging over the city. It was called the London Fog, but that was polite branding. In truth, it was smog thickened with soot, ash, and acidic particles that stripped paint from buildings and lungs from inside out. People described it as yellow, green, or brown, depending on the day, and it could become so dense that you could not see the hand in front of your face. These fogs killed quietly at first, then loudly. In December of 1873, one notorious smog lasted for 5 days. Death rates in London doubled as bronchitis and pneumonia ripped through the population. Horses dropped dead in the streets. Men collapsed on their way to work. Children suffocated in their beds while windows rattled from the cold and remained sealed shut. Yet the fires continued to burn, because coal was progress, and progress was worth dying for. Even when the smog lifted, the streets below were no safer. Imagine walking down a cobblestone road lined with open gutters, each carrying a mixture of sewage, animal droppings, and industrial runoff. Slaughterhouses poured blood into drains. Tanneries dumped vats of chemical-soaked hides into rivers. Dyers let their brilliant colours bleed directly into public waterways, leaving streams that shimmered red, blue or green like some grotesque rainbow. To a modern eye it might look almost artistic. To a Victorian throat it tasted of disease. The River Thames, once a source of life, became a ribbon of filth winding through the capital. By the 1850s it was so contaminated with raw sewage that newspapers called it a stinking ditch. In the summer of 1858, a heat wave cooked the waste until the stench forced Parliament to hang soaked curtains over its windows. Lawmakers gagged while trying to debate, their eyes watering from the fumes. The crisis was remembered as the Great Stink, and only then did reform begin in earnest. But for decades before and after, the Thames was less a river than an open wound. Factories added their own poisons to the mix. Matchstick factories employed workers who inhaled white phosphorus daily. Many developed a horrific condition called phossy jaw, where the bone in the jaw rotted away until it glowed faintly in the dark. Lead smelters poisoned their workers slowly with tremors and paralysis. Textile mills filled the air with dust so thick it coated the lungs like plaster. And yet these factories were celebrated as engines of progress, their towering chimneys rising like monuments to industry, while the people beneath coughed themselves toward early graves. The absurdity lay in the fact that many Victorians believed city air was healthier than the countryside. Country life smelled of manure and decay, while the city seemed vibrant with commerce and coal. The haze over the rooftops was described as proof of prosperity. Artists painted the smog as romantic mist. Couples strolled along rivers that looked like ink. To them, it was progress wrapped in a gentle glow. To us, it was collective asphyxiation disguised as atmosphere. You pull a handkerchief to your mouth and it turns black within minutes. Your lungs ache as though you have inhaled a bonfire, and each breath carries the faint tang of sulphur. The sound of coughing echoes everywhere around you. Men spit black phlegm into the streets. Women dab at their lips with handkerchiefs stained with blood. Horses snort clouds of soot before collapsing mid-stride. And still the streets buzz with life, because there is no alternative. This was modernity, and everyone was expected to adapt. Even the architecture carried reminders of the poisons in the air. Buildings blackened under decades of soot until their facades were unrecognisable. Monuments erected in white stone turned charcoal grey. Statues crumbled as acidic smog ate into the stone. The very city seemed to rot under its own fumes, a slow-motion collapse disguised as development. And just when you think the air cannot get heavier, the smell of gas drifts in from the lamplights. Gaslighting illuminated streets and homes, a marvel of modern convenience, but leaks were common. Explosions rattled through neighbourhoods. Carbon monoxide seeped into bedrooms. Families woke dizzy, if they woke at all. And yet gas lamps spread everywhere, bathing cities in a soft glow that hid the dangers flickering beneath. The danger of air was matched only by the danger of water. Wells in poorer districts often sat within feet of cesspits, their contents leaking into the groundwater. Cholera outbreaks swept through neighbourhoods like wildfire, killing thousands in weeks. For years, authorities clung to the idea that disease came from bad smells, rather than contaminated water. People sprayed perfume to ward off cholera while sipping directly from poisoned pumps. It took the relentless work of men like John Snow, who mapped outbreaks to contaminated water sources to prove otherwise. Even then, acceptance was slow, because acknowledging the truth meant rebuilding entire systems. As you walk through the streets, your boots slick with filth, your lungs thick with smoke, and your nostrils filled with rot, you realise there is no safe corner of this city. The poisons do not wait for you to find them. They surround you from the moment you step outside, and every cough in the crowd is a reminder of how fragile life has become under the weight of progress. And yet the city was still proud of itself. Newspapers boasted of new bridges and railways, never mentioning the casualties. Poets wrote of misty mornings, never admitting their throats burned. Families marvelled at the glow of lamps, never asking what seeped into their bedrooms at night. To live in the Victorian city was to walk willingly into a furnace disguised as civilization. Your head throbs, your eyes water, and the smog presses tighter, as though the city itself is a lung that refuses to let go. You stagger back toward your poisoned home, realizing that the air outside is no safer than the walls within. And just when you think you might collapse, you notice the glitter of new consumer goods in the shop windows, all promising to make life better, brighter and safer. But every one of them carries the same secret as the wallpaper. Progress in this age always came painted with poison. You stop to admire the shop window glittering with goods, the pride of Victorian consumer culture. Trinkets, toys and polished ornaments gleam behind glass, each one promising refinement and comfort. Yet every piece comes with a hidden toll, because in this world even luxury was contaminated. The very objects people surrounded themselves with were ticking hazards, and no family was safe from their quiet betrayals. Children were often the first victims. Toy makers embraced the same pigments that dyed wallpaper and dresses, splashing arsenic-based greens onto doll clothing, painted blocks, and even artificial fruit sold as playthings. Parents proudly handed their children bright toys that practically radiated sickness. Reports surfaced of little ones developing sores on their hands, coughing blood, or wasting away with stomach cramps, yet few made the connection. Childhood, already short in the 19th century, was often shortened further by a toy chest full of poison. Even books for children could be dangerous. Brightly coloured illustrations used the same pigments as wallpaper. A child sitting on the floor, paging through a storybook, could rub toxic dust into their mouth without ever knowing. In one infamous case, a publisher withdrew a series of children's picture books after it was discovered the green ink contained lethal amounts of arsenic. Education and entertainment doubled as chemical exposure disguised as literature. Household ornaments carried their own threats. Artificial flowers, popular in drawing rooms, were made from paper and fabric dyed with arsenic. One bouquet could shed a fine green dust across an entire parlour. Chemists who analysed them warned that a vase of flowers might be enough to poison everyone in a household over time. Yet they remained popular, because what respectable parlour was complete without a spray of roses that never wilted even if the owners did? Dining tables told the same story. Victorians loved fine china and ceramic plates, but the glazes often contained lead. Acids in food and drink leached the metal into meals. Crystal glasses sparkled under gaslight, but their brilliance came from lead oxide, which seeped into sherry and brandy with every toast. Families celebrated birthdays and weddings with drinks poured from containers that eroded their nerves and blackened their gums. Even cutlery could betray them, polished with chemicals that lingered long after the shine had faded. Candles and lamps meant to bring comfort brought their own misery. Some candles were tinted with arsenic pigments to glow beautifully when lit, releasing toxic smoke as they burned. Gas lamps often leaked carbon monoxide, and cheap oil lamps smoked heavily, filling rooms with fumes that inflamed lungs. Sitting down to read by lamplight was less a moment of leisure and more a long inhalation of irritants. Every flicker of flame carried a whisper of decline. Even cosmetics extended the reach of danger into daily rituals. Face powders often contained lead carbonate, which whitened skin but corroded it in the process. Lip tints used vermilion, a mercury-based pigment. Hair dyes relied on lead acetate, which darkened locks while seeping into the bloodstream. Perfume sometimes contained benzene derivatives that irritated the lungs. The quest for beauty demanded the slow surrender of health, yet advertisements promised elegance, refinement and admiration for anyone willing to suffer enough. It was not only vanity or wealth that carried hazards. Common objects for everyday use could be just as lethal. Wallpaper, as already known, poisoned families slowly. But even simple household fabrics, like curtains or upholstery, could be dyed with arsenic. Sitting in a plush armchair was to press yourself against a reservoir of toxins, each shift releasing microscopic dust. Families lived surrounded by ornaments and fabrics that worked steadily against them, unaware that comfort itself was compromised. The irony was that much of this was celebrated as progress. For centuries, colour had been expensive and rare, limited to the rich, but industrial chemistry made vivid colours affordable. Green was suddenly everywhere, as was purple made with aniline dyes, and red from coal tar derivatives. People marvelled at the richness of their surroundings, the vibrancy of their homes, and the dazzling variety of consumer goods. Few questioned whether the miracle of modern chemistry came with a price. Regulation lagged behind. Even after chemists and doctors raised alarms, manufacturers denied the dangers. The public, eager for refinement, often dismissed warnings as exaggerations. What was a rash compared to the prestige of a fashionable gown or a glittering glass? Newspapers occasionally carried horror stories, but they rarely dampened enthusiasm. Only when deaths became undeniable did attitudes begin to shift. You imagine yourself in a Victorian parlour now, seated in a high-back chair upholstered in shimmering green fabric. On the table beside you, a bouquet of artificial flowers dusts the air with invisible poison. A crystal glass glimmers, filled with sherry leaching lead. Children play at your feet with bright blocks and dolls painted with arsenic. The room is silent except for the faint crackle of the gas lamp overhead, filling the air with fumes. Everything looks prosperous, tasteful and civilized. Everything is also trying to shorten your life. The contradictions piled up in every corner of this world. Progress was celebrated, but progress killed. Luxury was admired, but luxury hurt. Even the simplest household felt like a carefully arranged trap, where the very items purchased to bring comfort slowly unravelled the body. To live in the Victorian age was to accept this bargain, often without realising it had been made. Your hands rest on the arms of the chair and come away dusty. You wipe them on your trousers, noticing the faint irritation rising in your skin. You glance at the children playing and realise their laughter hides a cost you cannot see. The air feels heavier, your temples pulse, and you know that the same consumer culture that promised joy has delivered something far different. And yet this was not even the most sinister aspect of the Victorian household, because poisons were not just hidden in products, they were also embedded in the very structure of homes. Plumbing, paint and building materials carried dangers that families lived inside every day. The house itself was a slow executioner, standing proudly on its foundation of hazard. You lean back in that parlour chair, surrounded by artificial flowers and leaded glass. But the danger is not confined to the trinkets and ornaments. It is deeper, quieter, built into the house itself. The walls, pipes, and paint that hold this home together are also working against you, layer by layer. You're not just living in a Victorian household, you're living inside a toxic machine. Start with the plumbing. In wealthier homes, running water was considered a mark of progress, a sign that civilization had conquered inconvenience. But the pipes carrying it were often made of lead. Every time you drew water, microscopic flakes of the metal dissolved into your cup. Over weeks and months it built up in the body, dulling the mind, blackening the gums, and slowly gnawing at the nervous system. The Victorians thought they had embraced modern comfort. What they had embraced was a constant drip of poison. Even homes without running water were not safe. Wells dug in crowded cities often sat within feet of cesspits or drains. Waste seeped through the soil until the water itself carried disease. Families drew bucket after bucket of what looked like clear liquid, never realising it was a cocktail of sewage and bacteria. Cholera outbreaks tore through neighbourhoods, killing thousands within weeks. And yet people still blamed the air, the smell, or even divine punishment, rarely suspecting the very water in their own kitchens. Walls were no refuge either. Paints used inside and outside homes were loaded with lead to achieve bright, durable colours. The pigment gave walls a glossy finish that looked expensive, but over time, the paint cracked and flaked. Children chewed on the chips, crawling along floors dusted with invisible poison. Even adults inhaled lead dust as they brushed past walls or scraped old paint. Decorating a home became an act of contamination, a quiet trade of beauty for health. The plaster beneath those paints could also betray you. Builders sometimes mixed lime with other materials that irritated skin and lungs. Cheaper houses used poor quality plaster that crumbled, filling the air with dust. Even wallpaper paste was sometimes blended with starches that attracted mould, filling rooms with spores that worsened breathing in already smoke-thickened cities. To live within 4 Victorian walls was to breathe in their disintegration with every breath. Roofs and ceilings added their own hazards. Thatched roofs in rural areas harboured vermin that spread disease. Slate roofs in cities dripped rainwater laced with soot and acidic residue into gutters that often overflowed directly into yards. Ceilings in crowded tenements sagged with damp, their plaster stained black with smoke and green with mildew. When they collapsed, which they often did, families were left buried under a rain of their own poison shelter. Even the floors beneath your feet were complicit. Carpets were dyed with arsenic to achieve brilliant greens and reds, while cheaper rugs shed fibres loaded with chemical treatments. Walking barefoot meant grinding dust into your skin. Sweeping the floor stirred clouds into the air. Children crawling across them were practically rolling in toxins. The comfort of a carpet was measured in coughs and rashes, but to visitors it looked refined, which was all that mattered. Lighting added another layer of danger. Gas pipes ran through walls, often leaking unseen. Poorly sealed fittings allowed carbon monoxide to seep into parlours and bedrooms, leaving families dizzy or dead by morning. Explosions were common when a stray flame met a pocket of gas, yet gaslight was celebrated as the great triumph of the age, and households embraced it eagerly, never realising that their modern glow came with an invisible shadow. Even the materials used to keep houses warm carried risks. Coal dust filtered into every crevice, coating walls and ceilings until rooms looked permanently grey. Chimneys clogged easily, belching smoke back into bedrooms. Fires were frequent as soot deposits ignited in flues. Families fell asleep to the warmth of their hearth, unaware that their lungs were filling with fine particles that scarred them with each breath. And if all that were not enough, rats and insects flourished within these homes, feeding on waste and mould. Arsenic powders were sprinkled liberally to combat them, leaving a residue across floors and counters. The same substance used to kill vermin was tracked across tabletops where meals were served. Progress meant cleaner homes in theory, but in practice cleanliness and contamination were indistinguishable. You glance around this Victorian home and realise the structure itself is a slow betrayal. Every beam, pipe and painted wall is loaded with hazards invisible to the eye. Families built their lives here, celebrated milestones, raised children and hosted guests. Yet the very house that sheltered them was steadily dismantling their health, brick by brick. The most bitter irony is that many of these homes were new. They were built to showcase modernity, to prove that life had advanced beyond the damp medieval hut or the smoky Tudor hall. But in chasing progress, Victorians built monuments of poison, temples of refinement that also served as tombs. What they called the modern home was often a coffin with wallpaper. Your hand trails along the painted wall, fingers brushing flakes of lead paint. You hear the drip of water from a pipe that gleams faintly with corrosion. The floor creaks beneath your weight, and a faint puff of dust rises into your throat. Everything looks so solid, so respectable, and yet you feel your body weakening under its silent weight. And still the shopkeepers outside call to you, promising more luxuries, more marvels of modern invention, more comforts that will turn your life into a showcase of refinement. The danger is not just in the walls of the house. It extends into every market, every advertisement, every product designed to improve your world. The poison does not stop with what surrounds you. It deepens in the very culture that demands you buy more. You leave the Victorian home behind, but the dangers follow you out the door and onto the bustling streets. Shop windows gleam with polished goods. Posters plaster walls with bold fonts, and hawkers shout promises over the rattle of carts. Every corner of the city seems alive with the idea that modern living is not just available but essential. Yet what you are really witnessing is not just a shopping spree. It is the birth of consumer advertising, and much of what it sold was poison dressed in poetry. Victorian advertising was nothing if not persuasive. Posters promised miracle tonics that cured headaches, indigestion, and melancholy with a single spoonful. They conveniently omitted the arsenic, mercury, or opium inside. The language of marketing leaned heavily on progress, science, and elegance. If a product had a long chemical name, it must be modern. If it glowed in a colour not found in nature, it must be fashionable. Truth mattered less than appearances, and appearances were for sale on every street. Soap was marketed as the key to cleanliness and moral virtue. Pear's soap famously advertised itself with images of glowing white skin, presenting hygiene as both health and social respectability. But soaps could contain caustic soda or colouring agents that burned skin. Still, mothers bought it gladly, because the poster promised that a clean child was a good child, even if the bath left them with a rash. The association between morality and purchase was cemented by images rather than reality. Cosmetics and medicines leaned even harder on this sleight of hand. Advertisements for arsenic wafers promised a smoother complexion. Lead powders were sold with images of radiant women whose beauty was credited to their brand. Mercury ointments were praised as cures for stubborn skin conditions. The absurdity was that many customers recognized the risks, but they trusted the authority of the printed word. If a glossy pamphlet said it was safe, who were they to question? Factories churned out goods faster than ever, and advertising had to keep up. Companies competed to plaster their products across newspapers, billboards, and handbills. Streets were littered with bright posters promising elegance and energy. One day it might be a cure for coughs, the next day a new wallpaper pattern that brought freshness to your home. Both might shorten your lifespan, but the promise of refinement drowned out hesitation, and the designs themselves were works of art. Lithography allowed for vibrant colours and striking images. A poster for a cough syrup might feature a smiling child holding a bottle, even though the bottle was filled with laudanum strong enough to sedate a horse. A wallpaper advertisement might show a cosy parlour bathed in glowing green light, never mentioning that the green was arsenic dust ready to irritate lungs. The artistry of advertising became a mask, one painted so brightly that the poison beneath went unnoticed. Even toys were sold with this sheen of innocence. Posters showed children happily playing with dolls or painted blocks, their rosy cheeks suggesting health. Parents bought the same toys, unaware that the pigments brushed onto the surface were lethal. When complaints arose, manufacturers deflected, insisting that the colours were harmless, or that illnesses must come from other sources. By the time medical journals began connecting the dots, the advertising machine had already done its work. The sheer scale of advertising was staggering. By the late 19th century, entire industries existed just to design and distribute promotional material. Companies hired artists, printers, and street hawkers to flood the senses of potential customers. In London alone, thousands of posters could be pasted in a single night, transforming the city into a gallery of persuasion. It was relentless, and the more relentless it became, the more unquestioned the products grew. You picture yourself now walking through a Victorian street thick with posters. Everywhere you look, bright images compete for attention. A woman smiling with flawless skin thanks to arsenic wafers. A child blowing bubbles beside a bottle of syrup laced with morphine. A family gathered around a glowing lamp, unaware of the gas leaking beside them. Every picture tells a story, and every story is a lie wrapped in artistry. You feel your head ache as the noise of persuasion presses in as heavily as the smog overhead. The genius of Victorian advertising was not just that it sold products, it sold identity. To purchase the right wallpaper was to prove refinement. To buy the right soap was to prove morality. To serve drinks in crystal glasses was to prove status. Every purchase became a declaration, and people were willing to trade their health for the appearance of belonging. Progress was no longer just about survival. It was about presentation, and advertising made sure presentation trumped truth. What makes it all the more absurd is that newspapers themselves relied on advertising revenue. So when stories of poison surfaced, they were often buried or softened. One column might warn of arsenic in wallpaper, while the next page carried an advertisement for the very same product. Readers trusted their papers, but their papers were already compromised by the same system that profited from their suffering. As you stand in that street, a poster flaps loose in the wind, its colours too vibrant, its promises too perfect. You realise that the city itself is a theatre, every wall and every window another stage for persuasion, and the actors are bottles, fabrics, powders and paints, all smiling as they bow you into your grave. The real genius of Victorian poisons was not how they were made, but how they were sold. Your stomach churns, your throat itches, and you feel the weight of the handbill pressed into your palm by a passing hawker. The words glow with promises of health and happiness, yet your body knows better. Progress is not for your benefit, it is for their profit, and the more you believe, the faster the poison spread. But even the advertisements were only one layer of deception. Beyond the posters and products lay another realm of danger, where poison shaped entire industries, fueled fortunes, and built empires. The story of Victorian poison was not confined to homes and shops. It stretched across factories, railways, and global trade, embedding itself in the very engines of empire. Factories did not simply feed homes with poison, they fed entire nations. The glittering empire that spanned continents in the 19th century owed part of its wealth to the same substances that were rotting jaws and blistering skin in Britain. The poisons that killed families in drawing rooms also built fortunes in boardrooms, and every shipment that left a port carried not just goods, but hazards spread across the world. Arsenic itself was a booming business. By the 1840s, Britain was producing thousands of tons annually, much of it extracted from copper ore in Cornwall. What had once been a byproduct became a commodity, shipped to factories that churned it into pigments, pesticides, and medical treatments. Miners worked in clouds of dust so toxic it eroded their lungs, yet the output was celebrated as a triumph of industrial efficiency. The green that papered drawing rooms in Manchester and Paris began its life in the Cornish mines, dug from earth that claimed men before their 40th birthdays. Lead had a similar story. Smelters in the north of England poured smoke into the skies, while refining metal for paints, pipes, and glazes. Villages near the works reported livestock dying in fields, crops withering in soil, and children falling ill with mysterious tremors. Still, the furnaces burned day and night, feeding an empire that equated bright colours and sturdy pipes with progress. Whole towns were shaped around industries that poisoned them, and people accepted shorter lives in exchange for steady wages. The dye industry provided another absurd tale. Synthetic dyes created in the mid-19th century like Movine transformed fashion with vivid purples and blues, but many early dyes relied on coal tar and chemical residues that irritated skin and stained hands. Workers in dye houses often emerged with their clothes soaked in colours that looked festive but left their lungs scarred. Europe celebrated the dawn of modern chemistry while ignoring the men and women coughing their way into shallow graves. Exports spread these hazards across the globe. Arsenical pigments coloured wallpapers sold as far as India and the Americas. Shipments of toys, fabrics and decorations spread lead and mercury into foreign markets. Colonies became dumping grounds for products deemed too risky at home, a grim echo of empire's double standards. Progress was exported as poison, and the empire's glow came at the expense of health not just in Britain, but everywhere its ships docked. Factories themselves were nightmares of exposure. Workers in matchstick factories inhaled phosphorus daily, their faces illuminated at night by the eerie glow of phossy jaw, a condition where the bone in the jaw rotted until it emitted a faint light. Children employed in textile mills spent 12 hours a day in air thick with fibres that lodged deep in their lungs. Lead workers carried the tremors of poisoning home with them, their hands shaking too violently to lift a spoon. Yet factory owners boasted of productivity, and investors collected profits while avoiding the smoke-filled rooms entirely. The absurdity was compounded by the fact that many of these substances had military uses as well. Arsenic compounds were tested as pigments for uniforms and as preservatives for supplies shipped overseas. Gunpowder production relied on chemical processes that exposed workers to toxic byproducts. Even medicines for soldiers sometimes contained mercury or opium, leaving armies staggering under the same weight of poison as civilians. An empire built on industry was also an empire built on substances that unbuilt the human body, and yet the public saw only the surface. Factory tours showed gleaming machinery and orderly rows of workers, not the hidden costs in blood and bone. Exports were celebrated as proof of Britain's superiority. Never mind that crates of wallpaper carried the same hazards abroad as at home. The global reach of the empire was matched only by the global reach of its poisons, woven quietly into the fabric of commerce. You picture yourself standing now on a Victorian dockyard. Ships loom in the mist, their holds filled with barrels of pigment, crates of toys, bolts of fabric dyed too brightly to be natural. The air stinks of coal and salt, and dock workers sweat as they load cargo that will sicken families thousands of miles away. Above you, banners proclaim Britain as the workshop of the world. Below you, rats scurry across planks dusted with arsenic powder. Every crate is a promise of prosperity. Every crate is also a delivery of death. The irony is that science itself often knew better. Chemists raised alarms, doctors documented patterns of illness, and reformers published pamphlets warning of the dangers. But industry moved faster than regulation. Profits outweighed caution, and the empire thrived on the very substances that crippled its people. What was a rash or a cough compared to global dominance? What was a few thousand sick workers compared to ships brimming with goods? The scale of it all is dizzying. The poisons were not accidents or isolated blunders. They were structural, woven into the economy, baked into the empire's expansion. They lined parlors, painted dresses, flavoured foods, and filled medicine bottles. They travelled from Cornwall's mines to London's factories to far-off colonies, and at every step they were celebrated as proof of progress. The empire glittered because it glowed with chemicals, and that glow carried a quiet cost. Your lungs ache as you watch the cargo disappear into ships bound for foreign harbours. The shouts of dock workers echo against warehouses blackened with soot. The sea smells of salt and coal, a bitter combination that clings to your throat. You realise the poisons of this age were not just hidden in homes but carried across oceans, spreading quietly into new markets and new bodies. The empire did not just conquer land, it conquered health, trading years of life for barrels of pigment. And yet even this was not the full reach of Victorian poison. Beyond commerce and empire, poisons crept into the very realm of leisure. They coloured theatres, ballrooms, and even the entertainments that distracted people from their daily misery. The pursuit of amusement carried its own hazards, and pleasure in the Victorian age was rarely free of pain. You follow the sound of music drifting down a gaslit street and step inside a Victorian theatre. For a moment it feels like you've escaped the soot and stink outside. Velvet curtains hang heavy over the stage, chandeliers glow above polished heads, and the air is warm with the hum of expectation. But even here, in a space meant for pleasure, you are breathing danger. Entertainment in this age was never just amusement. It was another avenue for poison to slip unnoticed into daily life. The first hazard is the air itself. Theatres and music halls relied on gaslighting, which filled the space with warmth and glow, but also leaked carbon monoxide. Audiences sometimes felt lightheaded before a play had even begun. In poorly ventilated halls, the atmosphere grew stifling as hundreds of bodies exhaled into rooms already thick with gas. The flicker of lamps was enchanting, but behind the charm lurked headaches, dizziness, and occasionally fainting fits. Costumes brought their own risks. Stage performers dazzled audiences in gowns dyed brilliant greens, reds, and yellows. Many of these dyes were arsenic-based, chosen for their unnatural vibrancy under lamplight. Performers who wore them for hours developed sores and rashes, coughing fits that worsened with every show. Artificial flowers pinned to hair or corsets shed dust into throats and lungs. Applause rang out for actresses glowing in emerald silks, but the glow was slowly burning them away. Even props were complicit. Painted backdrops dripped with toxic pigments. Decorative items on stage, from artificial fruit to painted furniture, were treated with the same chemicals as household ornaments. Actors and stagehands handled them nightly, rubbing poison into their skin with every rehearsal. To bring fantasy to life required saturating the set with colours that were deadly when inhaled or touched. The audience did not escape either. Fashion at the theatre mirrored fashion at home. Women arrived in arsenic-dyed gowns, men in waistcoats polished with toxic finishes. Perfumes heavy with chemical extracts clashed with the gas lamps until the entire room reeked of artificial sweetness layered over smoke. Breathing in such a space was less like watching a play, and more like sitting inside a scented furnace, and yet audiences flocked to these venues night after night, seduced by the spectacle, blind to the hazards woven into every detail. Balls carried similar dangers. Gas chandeliers dripped soot and fumes onto polished dance floors. Gowns swirled in clouds of fabric dust dyed with arsenic. Partners clasped gloved hands treated with powders that irritated skin. Musicians played through air so heavy with smoke that their eyes watered under the strain. By midnight, throats were raw, temples pounded, and coughs echoed across the hall. Yet everyone smiled, because to attend was to belong, and belonging outweighed the discomfort clawing at their lungs. There were spectacular accidents as well. Gaslighting was notorious for sparking fires, and theatres burned with frightening regularity. The combination of open flames, crowded wooden structures, and heavy curtains meant that a single mishap could turn a performance into a tragedy. In 1887, the Exeter Theatre Royal caught fire, killing nearly 200 people. Many suffocated from smoke long before the flames reached them. Safety standards were slow to follow, because to dim the lights or widen the exits meant acknowledging the danger, and acknowledgement never sold tickets. Even the growing popularity of fireworks and public spectacles carried hazards. Displays often relied on chemicals like potassium chlorate and sulphur, which when mishandled exploded violently. Spectators inhaled plumes of smoke heavy with toxic residue. The glow was thrilling, the bangs exhilarating, but each shower of sparks left a trail of poison hanging in the air. Celebration and contamination arrived together, hand in hand. The absurdity was that Victorians often praised these entertainments as wholesome escapes from daily life. Reformers worried about morality but rarely about health. Parents took their children to pantomimes, unaware that the costumes and painted scenery might be shedding arsenic into their lungs. Couples attended operas, leaving afterward with headaches they attributed to wine rather than the carbon monoxide overhead. The body complained, but society insisted that pleasure was worth the price. You sit in the theatre now, eyes fixed on the stage where a performer glows in emerald silk. The air feels thick, your chest heavy, your temples pulsing with the combined weight of perfume, smoke and gas. Around you, fans flutter as women try to stir the stagnant air. Men dab their foreheads, flushed from the fumes as much as the heat. The orchestra plays on, each note swallowed by the haze. You realise that entertainment here is not an escape from poison. It is simply another performance of it. The irony is hard to miss. The very spaces designed for beauty and amusement mirrored the larger society that built them. Glamour sat on top, but beneath it lay a structure of hazards, hidden, denied and accepted as the cost of modern life. Pleasure came wrapped in toxins just as surely as work did, and no stage could hide the truth forever. Your throat itches as the final applause thunders through the hall. You rise from your seat, coughing into a handkerchief already darkened with soot. The crowd surges around you, smiling through the same haze that has left you gasping. Outside, the night air tastes no cleaner. The same empire that painted its homes with poison and sold its goods with lies also built its leisure on fumes and fire. The curtain has fallen, but the performance of poison never ends. And beyond the theatre, another world of poison thrived. The poisons that dazzled on stage were not limited to entertainment. They were carefully monitored, studied, and even collected in laboratories, where scientists and doctors attempted to measure their effects. But the line between science and suffering blurred easily in this age, and the study of poison often meant new forms of exposure. The applause fades, the gas lamps flicker out, and you step back into the night, but the poisons do not vanish with the curtain. They follow you into another world entirely, one that promised reason, discovery, and truth. The Victorian age was intoxicated with science, a period when laboratories hummed with curiosity and doctors scribbled endlessly in notebooks. Yet much of what they studied was the very stuff that was killing their patients, and in trying to solve the mystery of poison, they often drenched themselves in it. Arsenic, mercury and lead were not mysterious to chemists. They had been known for centuries. But the Industrial Revolution turned them from curiosities into commodities, and scientists scrambled to understand their effects. The irony was that some of the best research came not from careful experiments, but from corpses. Doctors performed autopsies on families dead from mysterious illnesses, peeling back the layers of organs marbled with green or grey residue. Arsenic, when it built up in the body, left distinctive marks, but connecting those dots required staring at far too many bodies laid out on tables. One of the earliest breakthroughs came in the field of toxicology. James Marsh, a British chemist in the early 19th century, developed the Marsh test to detect arsenic in human tissue. It was ingenious, a method that finally allowed courts to prove arsenic poisoning in trials. Before that, suspected poisonings were often dismissed as bad luck or indigestion. Marsh's invention changed criminal law, but it also exposed how common arsenic was. When you invent a test for poison and immediately find it everywhere, it says something unsettling about your society. Doctors themselves frequently blurred the line between healer and poisoner. Arsenic was prescribed in small doses for conditions ranging from skin disorders to syphilis. Mercury ointments were rubbed onto rashes and swallowed in pills. Calomel, a mercury chloride compound, was given as a laxative, its side effects interpreted as signs of progress rather than warning. Patients sweated, vomited, and lost teeth, but the suffering was taken as evidence that the cure was working. It was medicine by endurance test. Even the study of gases carried its perils. Chemists experimented with chlorine, phosgene, and coal gas, inhaling fumes in the name of science. Laboratories often smelled less like learning and more like execution chambers. In one famous case, Humphrey Davy, who had experimented with laughing gas decades earlier, nearly suffocated himself during his tests. The lesson was not learned. Victorian science thrived on trial and error, and error usually meant another scientist collapsing on the floor. The absurdity stretched into forensics. Doctors tasked with proving cause of death often worked in poorly ventilated rooms, surrounded by specimens preserved in arsenical solutions. Medical museums proudly displayed jars of organs floating in liquid that slowly poisoned anyone who lingered too long. Students handled cadavers dusted with chemical preservatives, wiping their hands on aprons that absorbed toxins like sponges. Training as a doctor was as much an exercise in resilience as education. Meanwhile, public fascination with science turned poisons into entertainment. Demonstrations were given at lectures where chemists showed the brilliant glow of arsenic pigments or the explosive potential of certain compounds. Audiences clapped at the colours, oblivious to the vapours drifting toward them. It was science as spectacle, and like every Victorian spectacle, it came laced with risk. Pharmacy too was a frontier of contradiction. Apothecaries sold remedies bottled in elegant glass jars, many of them filled with substances now labelled as hazardous. Arsenic was sold as a tonic for vitality. Morphine could be bought with little restriction. Cocaine was recommended for toothaches. Customers trusted the science stamped on labels, but in reality, each purchase was another spin of the wheel, relief or ruin, depending on the dose. You walk into a Victorian laboratory now, the air sharp with acid fumes, benches cluttered with glass apparatus. A chemist leans over a flame, heating a sample of wallpaper to test for arsenic, while another records notes beside a bottle of mercury. The smell stings your eyes, your throat burns, and you realise that every man in the room is shortening his life in the name of discovery. Progress demanded sacrifice, and in this age, sacrifice often came measured in coughs and tremors. The fascination with poison even crept into culture. Crime stories filled newspapers, many centred on arsenic as the perfect murder weapon. Trials gripped the public, with crowds gathering to hear testimony about toxicology tests. Some even collected pamphlets on the subject as if they were fashion magazines. The more people learned, the more they obsessed, and poison became both a household threat and a parlour discussion. And still, the bodies piled up. Families wasted away under doctors' care, miners staggered home shaking from mercury fumes, and chemists collapsed in their laboratories. Science made progress. Yes, it developed methods to detect and diagnose, and it eventually pushed reforms. But the path there was paved with suffering. Every discovery was written into bones, organs, and nerves of those who had lived as test subjects, willing or not. You glance again at the laboratory bench. The flame flickers, the chemist leans closer, and you see the sweat drip from his brow. He inhales deeply, convinced that control and precision will protect him. But the truth of this age is unavoidable. Knowledge was won not through safety but through endurance, and poison was the tutor that never stopped teaching. And yet this obsession with science was not limited to the laboratory. It spilled into the courtroom, the classroom, and the streets. Poison became not just a domestic hazard or a scientific curiosity, but a social question, woven into debates about morality, progress, and law. The next chapter of its story would not be confined to bottles and wallpaper. It would be fought in the courts of justice, where poison became the ultimate weapon of both crime and prosecution. The laboratory fades, and you step into the hush of a Victorian courtroom. The air is heavy with expectation, every wooden bench filled with spectators craning to glimpse the accused. Poison had already slipped into parlours, kitchens, and bedrooms, but here it took on a new role. It was no longer an accident of industry or ignorance, it was deliberate. In the Victorian age, arsenic became not just a household contaminant, but the murder weapon of choice, and trials turned into theatre. Arsenic was terrifying precisely because it was ordinary. It was sold openly as rat poison, insecticide, and even as a household cleaner. You could buy it from a chemist for pennies, no questions asked. It had no taste when mixed into food or drink, and its symptoms, nausea, vomiting, stomach cramps, could be mistaken for common illnesses like cholera. A murderer did not need strength or violence. They needed only a teacup and patience. Victorian newspapers feasted on these stories. Trials involving arsenic drew crowds as large as plays. Readers devoured lurid details about wives accused of poisoning husbands, servants accused of poisoning families, or lovers accused of poisoning rivals. The accused were often described with theatrical flair: frail widows, dashing suitors, cold-eyed killers. Arsenic turned the courtroom into a stage, and every trial became a public spectacle. The Marsh test, developed in the 1830s, gave prosecutors their first reliable weapon. By applying heat to a sample and trapping the resulting gas, chemists could produce a silvery mirror deposit that proved the presence of arsenic. It was dramatic, visible to jurors, and convincing in ways earlier science had not been. Suddenly, poison cases could be proven, and arsenic lost some of its invisibility. But the very drama of the test also fueled public obsession. People thrilled at the idea that science could unmask hidden killers, even as they worried how much arsenic might lurk in their own homes. One notorious case was that of Madeline Smith in Scotland, accused in 1857 of poisoning her lover with arsenic. The trial captivated Britain, with every sordid letter between them read aloud in court. The evidence was compelling, but the jury returned a verdict of not proven, a peculiarly Scottish compromise that satisfied no one. The case became a cultural landmark, reminding Victorians that poison was not confined to the lower classes. It seeped into drawing rooms and boudoirs as easily as into kitchens. What made arsenic particularly unnerving was its slow pace. Victims often lingered for days, suffering cramps, vomiting and convulsions, while their families and doctors puzzled over the cause. This delay allowed killers to appear solicitous, feeding their victims broth and wiping their brows while the poison continued its work. The performance of care could hide the reality of murder, and the dissonance disturbed Victorian sensibilities. The murderer was not a stranger in the night, but the person sitting at the bedside. The absurdity is that despite these fears, arsenic remained widely available. Chemists sold it without much regulation, until the Arsenic Act of 1851 required purchasers to sign a register and explain their use. Even then, enforcement was patchy. A respectable woman could still obtain it by claiming it was needed for rats or household cleaning. The very attempt at control only confirmed how common it had become, and every new poisoning reported in the press reignited public paranoia. Other poisons played their parts too. Cyanide, often used in photography and metalwork, offered quick death with a bitter almond scent. Strychnine, derived from the seeds of a tropical tree, caused horrific convulsions before death. But arsenic remained the star of the Victorian poison drama. It was cheap, subtle, and everywhere, the quiet partner in too many meals. You sit now in the gallery of the courtroom watching as the accused stands in the dock, pale under the gaze of hundreds. A chemist demonstrates the Marsh test, flames flickering as a silvery stain appears on the glass. The crowd murmurs, horrified and delighted. The judge adjusts his wig, the jury whispers, and the accused twists a handkerchief in trembling fingers. You feel your own stomach churn as though you too had tasted something bitter. The line between domestic accident and murder feels thinner than ever. The fascination with these cases reshaped the law. Juries learned to trust scientific testimony in ways they never had before. Toxicologists became celebrity witnesses, their names printed in newspapers alongside politicians and actors. Courts debated not only guilt and innocence, but the reliability of science itself. Each case tested the limits of knowledge, and every verdict echoed beyond the courtroom into the homes of readers who eyed their tea with new suspicion. Victorian culture absorbed this fear deeply. Novels, penny dreadfuls, and plays featured poisonings as central plots. Murder by arsenic became a trope, shorthand for betrayal hidden in domestic spaces. The popularity of such stories reflected both fascination and anxiety. People could not look away from the idea that the ordinary objects around them, a bottle of rat poison, a pot of stew, a glass of wine, might carry the seeds of death. And yet life went on. Arsenic continued to decorate wallpapers, dye dresses, and preserve specimens. The very substance that terrified jurors also coloured their parlours. The contradiction was never fully resolved. It lingered in the gap between fear and habit, a reminder that Victorian life was built on bargains no one wanted to admit. The trial ends with a verdict, the gavel strikes, and the crowd disperses into the gaslit streets. But the fascination does not fade. You hear them talking as they leave, speculating on motives, doses, and symptoms, as though discussing theatre rather than tragedy. Poison has become more than a household hazard or a criminal tool. It is entertainment, woven into the fabric of society, studied in courtrooms as much as in laboratories. And beyond the courts, the fascination only grew. Public health reformers, journalists, and activists began to campaign against the ubiquity of poisons, demanding stricter controls, cleaner cities, and safer homes. But change came slowly, and in the meantime Victorians continued to live among dangers that could not be entirely contained. The law had drawn new lines, but the poisons remained in every crack of daily life. The gavel's echo fades, and the crowd drifts into the smoggy night. But not everyone leaves the courtroom satisfied. Some carry more than gossip. They carry outrage. In an age when arsenic could be sold beside sugar and mercury could be prescribed as medicine, reformers began to stir. They were not always loud, and they were rarely popular, but their voices threaded through newspapers and pamphlets, warning that the marvels of modern life were laced with rot. The first real tremor of change came from journalists who refused to look away. In the 1850s, the Lancet launched a commission to investigate food adulteration. Their findings were appalling. Samples of sweets, bread, beer and milk were collected from ordinary markets, then tested in laboratories. Arsenic, lead, chalk and plaster appeared again and again. Children's candy was discovered to contain enough copper sulfate to poison a horse. Bread was whitened with alum. Beer was thickened with strychnine. The reports caused a sensation, splashed across headlines with a kind of grim pride Victorians reserved for scandal. Pamphleteers joined the charge. Campaigners like Arthur Hiller Saul wrote extensively about adulteration, exposing the hidden filth in food and the toxins in consumer goods. His detailed studies named cellars, listed ingredients, and shamed industries into defensive silence. Saul's work, though mocked at first, laid the groundwork for Britain's first real public health laws. It was one thing to whisper that candy made children ill. It was another to prove it in print with chemical tests and samples. The great stink of 1858 added fuel to the fire. When Parliament itself could no longer endure the stench of the Thames, lawmakers were forced to act. Curtains soaked in chloride of lime could not block the smell, and members gagged at their desks while trying to debate. The crisis embarrassed the government into approving funds for Joseph Bazalgette's massive sewer system, a project that finally diverted waste from the river. It was a rare moment when disgust overpowered inertia, but it showed that reform could come when suffering reached the right noses. Housing reform followed a similar path. Investigators published accounts of tenement life, describing rooms packed with families and dripping with damp. Reformers argued that poor ventilation and damp walls worsened the spread of tuberculosis and cholera. They did not always understand the mechanics. Germ theory was still controversial, but they sensed the connection between environment and illness. Campaigns slowly pushed for building regulations, clean water supplies and improved sanitation. Yet progress was uneven, and landlords often resisted anything that cut into profit. Even wallpaper finally drew scrutiny. Chemists began publishing warnings that arsenic pigments released dust, harmful to lungs and skin. In 1879, the British Medical Journal published cases linking arsenical wallpaper to illness and death, calling for its removal from homes. Manufacturers bristled, insisting the amounts were too small to matter, but whispers grew. Stories circulated of families wasting away in elegant parlours, their sickness easing only after green wallpaper was stripped. Reformers seized on these stories as proof that beauty itself could be a killer. What made these efforts so remarkable was how much they resisted the prevailing culture of denial. Victorians adored progress. They trusted that industry was lifting them into a modern age, even as it blackened their lungs and poisoned their water. Reformers had to fight not only corporations, but also a public unwilling to hear that their comforts were dangerous. To suggest that a fashionable dress or a glowing wall was lethal was to insult taste as much as health. Change required more than science. It required embarrassment, outrage, and sometimes sheer disgust. The push for reform spread beyond Britain. Across Europe, similar campaigns arose. In Germany, scientists warned against arsenical wallpapers. In France, debates erupted over lead glazes and contaminated water. International congresses on hygiene and sanitation began to appear, gatherings where reformers compared notes and urged governments to act. It was slow, but it was the beginning of modern public health as an organised force. You picture yourself now standing in a Victorian street, handbills pressed into your palm by reformers. One warns against adulterated milk, another against toxic wallpaper. A speaker on the corner shouts about sewers, while a chemist sets up a demonstration with coloured liquids to show hidden poisons. Passers-by mutter, some intrigued, others annoyed. Change is never comfortable, and in this world, comfort was wrapped tightly around the very poisons reformers wanted to banish. The absurdity, of course, is that progress only arrived when the wealthy were touched. Poor families had long suffered from bad bread, foul water, and crowded rooms, but their complaints drew little notice. When members of Parliament gagged in their chamber, reforms suddenly became urgent. When fashionable families collapsed under green wallpaper, newspapers declared scandal. The suffering of the poor was tolerated. The suffering of the powerful forced change. Still, these reforms mattered. They laid the foundation for later regulations for cleaner water, safer housing, and better food. They did not solve every problem, and poisons remained woven into daily life, but they showed that society could push back against the hazards it created. The victories were partial, the pace glacial, but the momentum had begun. Your throat burns as you read one of the handbills. The words blur slightly, your eyes watering from the cold smoke around you. A reformer presses another into your hand, urging you to believe, to act, to resist. Around you, the city continues as before, markets selling tainted goods, homes glowing with poisonous wallpaper, theatres flickering with gas fumes. But you sense a shift, however faint, as voices rise louder against the chorus of progress. And yet resistance was never the whole story. For every reformer shouting warnings in the street, there was an industry doubling down, inventing new chemicals, new colours, new marvels to replace the old. The war against poison was not a clean victory. It was a tug of war, and the poisons never surrendered easily. The pamphlet crumples in your hand as you walk down the street, but before the ink can dry, the other side of the story comes barreling toward you. Shopkeepers sneer at reformers, chemists roll their eyes, and companies flood the papers with their own proclamations. Progress was not something Victorian surrendered easily, and the industries built on poisons were not about to admit guilt. Denial was easier, cheaper, and far more profitable. Manufacturers of wallpaper were among the loudest. Arsenic dyes, they insisted, were harmless. The dust floating from walls was too small to matter, and the families wasting away in parlours were surely victims of bad air or weak constitutions. When chemists presented evidence that wallpaper pigments released arsenic into rooms, companies responded with pamphlets of their own, calling the claims exaggerated nonsense. They pointed to the thousands of homes adorned with green walls where no one had dropped dead at dinner. That many of those residents suffered chronic coughs and headaches was carefully ignored. The sugar industry took a similar approach when accused of contaminating beer with arsenic. After the Manchester poisoning of 1900, where thousands fell ill and dozens died from arsenic-tainted brews, producers scrambled to distance themselves. They argued it was an isolated mistake, not an industry-wide problem, even as investigations revealed widespread contamination. Newspapers recorded the scandal, but breweries fought hard to restore faith. Pints continued to pour, and the habit of evening drinking remained as strong as ever. Denial was lubricated by alcohol and profit. Cosmetic makers refused to abandon lead and mercury, arguing that the quantities used in powders and creams were too small to harm. They pointed to satisfied customers, ignoring those with blackened gums, trembling hands, and scarred skin. Advertisements continued to show radiant women with flawless faces, as if beauty itself were proof of safety. The industry clung to the idea that suffering was the fault of misuse rather than the product. If your lips turned blue, perhaps you applied too much rouge. If your skin peeled, perhaps you were too delicate for modern beauty. The textile industry was even bolder. Artificial flowers, dresses, and fabrics drenched in arsenic remained popular long after warnings circulated. Manufacturers claimed that the pigment was stable when bound to cloth, dismissing reports of sores and rashes. When workers in flour factories developed ulcers and arsenical poisoning, employers suggested better ventilation or cleaner habits, never safer dyes. To admit fault would be to shut down entire trades, easier to sacrifice workers than profits. You can see the absurdity clearly in the strategies they used. Industry spokesmen hired scientists willing to downplay risks. Papers were published reassuring the public that poisons were safe in moderation. Leaflets compared arsenic wallpaper to harmless paint dust or soot, suggesting that reformers were alarmists chasing attention. The tactic worked, because the average family wanted to believe it. No one enjoyed thinking their beautiful home was a death trap. Denial was comforting, and comfort always sold better than truth. The pushback even reached Parliament. Lobbyists argued that banning arsenic would cripple industries, raise costs, and strip elegance from British homes. They painted reformers as radicals trying to interfere with progress. Some politicians listened, themselves invested in companies that profited from poisons. Regulation stalled, watered down by debates over commerce versus safety. By the time laws did pass, generations had already breathed the dust, swallowed the powders, and stained their skin. You stand at a newsstand now, scanning the broadsheets. One column warns of arsenic in wallpaper, quoting chemists and doctors. Another, just inches away, carries an advertisement for a new green pattern praised as the latest fashion. The contradiction glares at you, but for most readers it barely registers. People chose which version of reality they preferred, and the version backed by wealth shouted louder. The same pattern repeated across industries. When evidence mounted, companies insisted their products were misunderstood. When deaths occurred, they were treated as isolated tragedies. When reformers protested, they were painted as hysterics, their pamphlets mocked as exaggerations. The narrative of progress remained intact, bolstered by the very industries profiting from its dangers. And it worked. Families kept buying wallpaper, powders, candies and dresses. Workers kept breathing fumes in factories. Newspapers kept running advertisements alongside warnings. The poisons remained, not because they were hidden, but because admitting their danger was simply too inconvenient. Profit and pride proved stronger than reform, at least for a time. Your throat tightens as you step away from the stand, the irony heavy in the air. The voices warning of poison are drowned out by the clamour of commerce. Shop windows glow with goods that shimmer with chemical brilliance, while pamphlets warning against them flutter unnoticed into the gutter. The city is not blind, it simply prefers not to see. And yet denial could only stretch so far. As the century wore on, disasters piled higher, evidence grew stronger, and public patience frayed. The poisons did not go quietly, but neither did the reformers. The struggle between profit and survival shaped Victorian life, and it left scars visible in statistics, stories and cemeteries. Still, the industries held their ground longer than you might expect. Every new warning was met with another defence, every reform delayed by another excuse. It was a dance of denial, and the victims were always the same. Families wasting away in parlours, children coughing in nurseries, workers collapsing in factories. The poisons remained, defended to the last breath by the hands that profited most from them. Your footsteps echo down the street, past posters and shop windows, past reformers waving pamphlets and merchants hawking goods. The noise of denial and reform blends into one restless chorus. And you realise that this fight was not only about wallpaper or candy or cosmetics, it was about the very definition of progress. Was progress measured by beauty and speed, or by health and survival? Victorians answered with hesitation, and their hesitation was lethal. And as you turn the corner, another truth waits. The poisons that haunted homes and industries did not stop at the city gates. They followed Victorians into the countryside, where farming and agriculture carried their own arsenal of hazards. The fields, no less than the parlours, became theatres of chemical danger, and the food grown in them carried its own quiet risks. The noise of the city fades as you walk past its choking chimneys and step into the countryside. For a moment it feels like you might finally breathe clean air. Rolling fields stretch before you, hedgerows glisten with dew, and farmers plod behind horses dragging heavy ploughs. It looks pastoral, timeless, and safe. But even here, the Victorian obsession with progress has sown its own harvest of poison. The soil itself has been drafted into the same war that wallpaper wages on parlours. Arsenic, the darling of industry and decor, also became the farmer's ally. By the mid-19th century, arsenical compounds were sold as pesticides to kill caterpillars and beetles. Potato crops were dusted with arsenic to fend off infestations, fruit trees were sprayed with it, and fields were littered with white powder to drive off insects. The result was effective in the short term but catastrophic over time. Animals that grazed on treated grass collapsed. Birds feeding on poisoned insects fell dead from branches. Farm workers, handling sacks of pesticide with bare hands, often developed sores, vomiting, and coughs that worsened with every season. The absurdity is that farmers often treated poisons casually, scooping powders with shovels and scattering them without masks or gloves. Safety equipment was nearly non-existent. Dust clung to hair, clothes, and skin, travelling home to wives and children. Entire families carried traces of poison simply because the head of the household had spent the day dusting cabbages. What was sold as agricultural progress was often a slow poisoning disguised as abundance. Fertilizers carried their own hazards. Guano, imported from Peru and other regions, was hailed as a miracle fertilizer, rich in nitrogen and phosphate. Ships carried thousands of tons across oceans, and Victorian farmers spread it over their fields with enthusiasm. But guano also carried pathogens and irritants, and the labour used to extract it from islands was itself brutal and deadly. Bones from animals, and sometimes even humans, were ground into fertilizers as well, creating dust that irritated lungs and carried disease. The fields of Britain were nourished by decay, a grotesque recycling system that left both soil and workers gasping. Milk, often imagined as the wholesome product of the countryside, was no safer than city beer. Cows fed on brewery waste or contaminated water produced milk that was thin, bluish, and prone to spoilage. To extend its life, sellers mixed in chalk, starch, and sometimes boracic acid. Children drank it daily, their growth stunted not only by poverty, but by a steady stream of chemicals in their breakfast bowls. Farmers rarely saw it as deceit. They saw it as survival in a competitive market. Even bread, the symbol of sustenance, remained treacherous. Rural millers adulterated flour with alum to whiten it, or with cheaper fillers to stretch supplies. Families who thought they had escaped city corruption by moving to the countryside found the same hazards lurking in their loaves. The wheat may have grown in fresh air, but by the time it reached the oven, it carried the same betrayals as any urban bakehouse. Animals too bore the brunt of agricultural poisons. Sheep dipped in arsenical baths to kill parasites sometimes staggered away poisoned themselves. Cattle drank from streams tainted by pesticides or factory runoff. Poultry pecked at scraps dusted with chemicals. The countryside was littered with carcasses of creatures sacrificed to the same progress that promised prosperity. Farmers often shrugged, writing off losses as part of the cost of modernity, but the losses were mounting. What made it worse was the gap between perception and reality. City dwellers imagined the countryside as pure and clean, a refuge from smog and filth. They paid extra for country produce, believing it free of the dangers that haunted urban life. In truth, the same chemicals spread across wallpaper and cosmetics were sprinkled across crops and livestock. The bucolic myth of fresh air and clean living was a fantasy. The fields were green, but the green was not always natural. Reformers tried to raise alarms here too. Reports circulated of livestock dying after grazing in treated fields. Newspapers published accounts of children falling ill after eating fruit dusted with arsenic. Scientists documented cases of poisoning among farm workers handling pesticides. But just as in the city, denial was easier than reform. Farmers argued that pests threatened entire harvests, and without chemicals, starvation loomed. Better to lose a few birds or workers than entire fields of grain. You walk between rows of potato plants, leaves glistening faintly from a recent dusting. The air smells metallic, sharp, and unnatural. Your throat itches as the breeze carries powder into your face. A crow flutters above, then plummets into the soil, wings twitching. The farmer keeps working unbothered, because this is simply how things are done. Survival here is measured not in safety but in yield, and yield always wins. Even rural water supplies betrayed trust. Wells dug near barns and cesspits often carried bacteria and chemical residue into buckets. Streams running through fields collected fertilizers, pesticides and animal waste, flowing toward villages downstream. Cholera outbreaks swept through rural areas just as they did cities, and the countryside's reputation for purity crumbled under the weight of disease. The illusion of safety dissolved, leaving only the reality of shared hazard. The countryside, like the city, wore its poisons with pride. Farmers celebrated new fertilizers, pesticides, and methods, just as urbanites celebrated wallpaper and cosmetics. Both embraced modernity, and both paid for it in illness. Progress did not distinguish between factory and field. It crept everywhere, clinging to every loaf, every bucket of milk, every blade of grass. You take another breath, the air heavy with dust, and realize there is no refuge. The poisons of this age were democratic. They infiltrated parlors and tenements, factories and fields. The city glowed with chemical colours, and the countryside bloomed with chemical crops. Everywhere, the promise of abundance carried the same bitter aftertaste. And beyond the farms and fields, another layer of danger awaited. The Victorians did not only produce poisons, they preserved them, collected them, and displayed them in exhibitions and fairs, celebrating their achievements without acknowledging the costs. Progress was placed on pedestals, quite literally, as a marvel for the public to admire, even as it whispered sickness into their lungs. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. If you enjoyed drifting off to the sound of arsenic wallpaper and exploding Victorian cows, let me know in the comments which historical disaster you'd like me to unravel next. And of course, if listening to centuries of human suffering helps you sleep better, make sure to check out my other videos for even more bedtime misery dressed up as history.